So we'll go ahead and get started. So let's start by doing a couple minutes of breathing meditation, just to give ourselves a little bit of a break. Transition into the class. So let's just sit comfortably with an upright spine. Just start to bring your awareness to the physical sensation of the breath and move your awareness away from anything else that's happening in your environment, and also trying to move it away from any thoughts of the past or plans for the future. Just using that physical sensation as an anchor point to hold yourself in the present. Again and again, letting go of anything else that arises in the mind, and again, bringing yourself gently back to that physical sensation. Then try to establish a virtuous motivation for your time in the class, thinking about whatever interested you, whatever skills you might be trying to cultivate, new habits, new familiarities, thinking about how those will benefit not only yourself, but also other sentient beings, those around you. Just intentionally cultivating the motivation to try to accomplish that, not only for your own benefit, but also for the benefit of those other beings. Bringing others into your circle of concern and engaging in virtuous activity for their benefit as well. All right, we'll get started. So before we move into the material, I always start by asking if anyone had a question. Maybe they were here last week and they had a question from that material, or maybe they've seen a video um, from one of the past classes in the series, and that caused them to have a question. Anything like that before we move on? If you did miss any of those, they are recorded, and so you can uh, eventually catch up. This is class 7 of 8, so we'll finish up next week. People are muted, but you can unmute yourself whenever you um, do have a thought or question. So we will be finishing up next week. Okay, so last week, we focused mainly on two things last week. We identified, of course, all of these classes are centered around how when we go throughout our lives, whenever we engage with other sentient beings or we relate to inanimate objects, anything in our environment, that act of being in relation to other sentient beings, other objects, is often influenced by ways in which that act of being in relation is not completely in line with the most realistic, most balanced way that we could be in that relation to other sentient beings or other inanimate objects. So we could say inanimate objects and animate objects if we wanted to say it that way. Other sentient beings and then inanimate objects. Those are the kinds of things that we're always in relationship to throughout every single day. We're in relationship to those two fields of external object. And it's very often the case that we perceive those objects either as being pleasant or as being unpleasant or as just being kind of in the background, being kind of neutral. And those categories, those ways of putting all of those objects into those conceptual boxes really governs a lot of how we choose then to be in relation to those objects. We want to pull in all of the objects that we put in the pleasant box. We want to push out all of the objects that we put into the unpleasant box. And we don't have much curiosity or interest in all of the objects that we put into the neutral box, the kind of the background box. And so going throughout our whole life, if we go through our whole life being under the influence of those ways of relating, Buddhism would point out that we are kind of missing out on a deeper, more accurate, more fulfilling in a way, and more meaningful possible field of relationship that we could be having. So in the last class, those are the themes that we keep coming back to in all of these classes, how that's playing out. And last week, we emphasized that those boxes are driven really, almost exclusively by the view that we have of this self-preoccupation, and wanting and needing and feeling very much like the main purpose of our life is to really just try to maximize personal enjoyment and to minimize personal discomfort, and then how that subconscious view gives rise to these conceptual categories that we then start to put everything in. So what we talked a lot about last week was looking at motivation and trying to switch that basic, and of course, as we discussed, that is a lifelong, gradual process of slowly developing greater inner awareness, greater introspective awareness, where we learn more about the mind and we learn more about what our motivations are, and then we learn skillfully, gradually over time to try to develop greater concern about others, about those that are around us, and looking at the real purpose of one's life as not being just that very narrow perspective of maximizing enjoyment and minimizing uncomfortable experiences or discomfort. Looking at trying to work for the welfare of others. And then by doing that, we saw how, by the way, we actually accomplish our own welfare as a byproduct. So it isn't that Buddhism or Buddhist thinking, encourages us to sacrifice. What it points out is that we're mistaken about the best mechanism for actually securing our own welfare. The best mechanism is actually to develop a wider concern, to develop a broader sense of motivation that encompasses and embraces others. And by doing that, we suffer less and we accomplish even potentially the highest level of our own welfare, if that's, something that if that's something that we're actually become interested in doing, that's also the mechanism that we can accomplish that by. So what we're getting at there, so then the next thing that we talked about last week was developing a greater sense of equanimity, which is again working with those boxes, those conceptual boxes, and trying to, on the basis of having this wider concern, on the basis of looking at motivation, trying to equalize those boxes that we put everything in, and developing a greater, more realistic, more sensible approach to how we relate to all of the things that we engage with on a daily basis. So here Lama Yeshe, with this particular quote, Lama Yeshe is getting at that the extremes that we are subject to, that we all are consistently experiencing daily, really in a way, these highs and these lows, these extremes of experience, they are a result of this process that we are talking about. And so it isn't that it's just one or the other, but he says that both are symptomatic of this internal process of feeling like I have to bring in what I think is pleasant and I have to be separated from what I think is unpleasant. That subconscious view, by its nature, will give rise to these extremes. And these extremes are both agitated states. So often in our culture, in our society, we're often encouraged to try to pursue that extreme state of, what here he might call ecstasy. Here, the just the having of as much sensory enjoyment as we can manage on a day-to-day basis. That's what we're presented with in our society, in our culture, as kind of being the point. But Lama Yeshe is helping us to see that that's actually just another form of agitation. And it's also suffering. It's also, because it's dependent upon how successful we are in bringing things into our experience, it's also a state of suffering. It's also a state of mental unease, mental agitation. There's a fundamental lack of balance there. And so the extent to which we actually can use our life to work with this energy that's giving rise to this unbalanced state, that's what Lama Yeshe is ultimately going to encourage us to try to think more about and to try to put more effort into doing. But today we're going to go in a little bit different direction, because he has a section on karma. And so that's what we're going to. So of course it's a huge topic, and there's a lot of complexities and a lot of ways in which we really won't be looking at it, that it could be looked at in the more historical, traditional ways. And if people have questions, there's certain things, we can go into to some degree. But the main way that we're going to look at it is as an internal psychological process, and how it functions, kind of on a more day-to-day basis psychologically. But is everything still clear for everyone? Does anyone have a thought or a question so far? So what he starts to say about this topic is, so we've talked about trying to be more balanced and how things are unbalanced. And here that's this idea of uncontrolled perception, how our narrow ego identity is because we have this sense of unbalanced perception, we're kind of, and we've talked before in the other classes about how we've used sort of the analogy of these falling dominoes, and how we get kind of knocked over in our behaviors at that sort of the end of that process. And he's saying that that is what's sort of happening here, and that's what he's going to be referring to as karma. So karma, from the Buddhist perspective, we could define karma as the law of cause and effect. So again, looking at this chain of mental events and how they result in our behaviors, how they result in our actions. So that was really why last week we emphasized motivation. And we talked a lot about how motivation is what underpins so much of what this whole class is talking about, because our behaviors are really nothing more than mechanisms for actualizing our intentions, our motivations. They're just, we start with the motivation, we start with the intention, and then we really look around at what's possible, we look around at what we have access to, and we try to find some process that will allow us to bring about that motivation. And when that process is out of control, as he's saying here, then then we start to get into a more problematic aspect of that. So the next point that he makes is that oh, sorry, these don't show up quite as. I don't know if that's. I guess maybe it works okay either way. So this idea here, the energy of all internal and external phenomena is interdependent. This is hinting at, in a way, a deeper way that we can understand karma, which is to say that the Buddhist view does assert that our mind and external reality are linked. And so, in a way, but this is going to this could go into directions in karma that are probably more well suited to, like, the Discovering Buddhism module on karma, or other ways in which karma can be talked about in the center. But if we look at this as an internal psychological process, then the key here is to understand that we can start to, through the process of developing greater and greater introspective awareness through meditation, through study, through trying to cultivate the mind in more intentional ways, then we can see relationships between mental states. And we can start to see how the things that we kind of think of as just being the way things are, or being outside of our control, that they are part of a causal chain. And we really do have, Buddhism asserts that we really do have a great, at least it's possible eventually, to have greater and greater control over these mental states, and how these mental states influence and interact with each other over time. And so what that is getting at is that over time, the extent to which we can cultivate more realistic ways of seeing things, the more that we can cultivate more positive states of mind, like patience and compassion and generosity and loving kindness, that what we ordinarily might see as being outside of our control, meaning things like jealousy, things like feelings of ill will towards others, things like a sense of depression or anxiety. And of course, in certain circumstances, some things have a more medical, certainly there's certainly absolutely important roles for other kinds of things, like therapy and different things. It's not to say that that's not true, but it is also the case that through intentional cultivation of these more positive mental states, that we will see shifts in those other types of mental states. That the more that we're capable of focusing our mind and cultivating those more positive mental states, then what Buddhism is suggesting is that we will see a reduction in over time of the influence of all of these more problematic states that we've been looking at. That if we can intentionally cultivate a more balanced, more realistic frame of mind through study, through meditation, then we will find that spontaneously, that naturally, our mind will have a greater sense of ease, will have a greater sense of contentment and peace of mind. And so there is a link between what we're trying to, the times that we try to intentionally cultivate these states, and then in daily life, as we're going about daily life, as we're interacting with others, the kinds of states of mind that arise during those interactions. So we can start to see how all of those things relate to one another, and that the things that look to be outside of our ability to control, or the things that seem like they're just what happened to us sometimes, we can start to see how they're actually related to other parts of the mind, and then we can work on those parts, and then the results of working on those parts will naturally start to be experienced in daily life. Any thoughts or questions as we're going along? So, as the way in which we're talking about that kind of leads to this next idea that, of course, in our culture, perhaps, of course, the whole idea of karma isn't part of our culture. We didn't grow up with this way of thinking, this way of talking about things. And so for us, it can just sort of be abstract. But what Lama Yeshe is suggesting is that it's actually a science of the mind, that the more introspective awareness we can generate, the clearer it will be to us in our own direct experience that the mind really does work this way. That when we set ourselves upon intentionally trying to develop certain ways of seeing the world and relating to others, then we will, again, in our own direct scientific experience, start to see the benefits of doing that. That it isn't an abstract, philosophical theory, but that it is actually just a description of how the mind actually functions. And that our own suffering is very much the result of the things that right now are predominating, the things that right now are having a stronger influence over the way that we relate to others. But it's only a matter of some time and some effort that gives rise to different familiarities, different habits, different perspectives. And on that basis, the things that are giving rise to our suffering today are gradually phased out, are gradually and slowly replaced by these new, more constructive, more beneficial habits and tendencies. And so here, this next idea is really talking in a way about Buddhist ethics, and how we, this is really Buddhist ethics as a vehicle for that kind of, as one vehicle at least, for developing that more realistic, more balanced, and more peaceful way of relating to others. Because we, and again, this goes back to maybe in a way an issue with our sort of the Judeo-Christian viewpoint that can kind of get superimposed in a problematic way on this kind of wisdom, on this kind of understanding, because we're kind of used to, coming from that particular background, we're kind of used to the idea of morality being kind of external, and being kind of this set of rules or regulations that we're just meant to agree to, that we're just kind of meant to follow. But what Lama Yeshe is pointing out is that relating to others through the lens of ethics arises simply, in a way, it's a set of principles that are not imposed from outside. They arise from a knowledge, a deep knowledge of from within, that they sort of bubble up from introspective awareness. So rather than being something that we're submitting to from the outside, they naturally flow from a deep understanding of what gives rise to our own happiness, what gives rise to our own contentment. Because again, the sort of the things that we've come back to again and again is that the more difficult or problematic aspects that Lama Yeshe has been encouraging us throughout the material to think about, they are, when they arise, they're painful for oneself. And Buddhism would suggest that unethical actions are also an extension of that, that when we relate to others through deception, through a sense of using others to just get what we would like, looking at others as a means of pleasing the ego, that's a painful way to be in the world, and that it is at odds from the kind of wisdom that Lama Yeshe is encouraging us to develop, that arises through looking at the way that the mind actually works, and recognizing that, again, that we have just kind of mistaken ideas about how things are related, about what reliably will give rise to my own inner joy, my own inner contentment, my own inner peace. We think that we know we think that we do understand that process, and what Buddhism, what kind of this wisdom is pointing out, is that unfortunately we've made mistakes in that process, and but that we can correct those mistakes, that we can put ourselves on a real path of growth and development where we can get to a place where we understand, deeply understand, experientially understand, by observing the mind, how to actually give rise to that deeper sense of contentment and joy, and and relating to others in that more realistic, more open, less kind of clinging, less needy, less, in a way, less neurotic sort of perspective. And so, really, in that way, ethical conduct is one vehicle, one mechanism that when we embrace it, when we understand it, when we try to develop it, it is not an imposition. It is not a suffering kind of list of rules that, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. It is the vehicle that liberates us from the kinds of mistaken ways of relating that actually cause us to suffer more than what, is kind, in a way, it's kind of like, when we're children, and we think that, we would really like to just have, several chocolate bars for dinner, but our parents have a greater sense of wisdom, and they're like, no, you really need to. We think of that as some sort of like terrible, painful imposition that's being foisted on us from the outside, but it's really just a lack of our own wisdom. It's a lack of our own understanding. And in that way, our parents know better than us. And now we don't do that. And now as adults, we do have, we have some, we haven't fully from the, if we're going to use that analogy, then the enlightened beings, Lama Yeshe and these great, they are these people that have this incredible insight that we still, unfortunately, to some degree lack. But we can see how, in some ways, we've made certain levels of progress in this. And this is just about making more progress. This is just about learning, well, what are the ways in which we haven't fully made progress, and how can we cultivate even more progress? So we can kind of appreciate how there are kind of these natural, that when you understand kind of how the body works, not in a moralistic way, but in an actual biological way, that gives rise to certain reasonable rules that we all now are better at following. And Lama Yeshe is saying, well, the mind is the same. The mind, when you really understand the mind, it will tell you, it will show you what is the better framework, what is the more realistic framework for getting what you want. And that it's not being superimposed, it's actually just arising organically from what's valid and from what's really true about how that system operates. Any thoughts or questions so far? There's some chat things I might be missing. So, sorry, I got caught up in all of these windows that are open. So, I mean, historical Buddhism would suggest that we, that it is true. I mean, of course, it's up to us to decide how much of historical Buddhist thinking we want to take on board and all of that. But Buddhism would suggest, historical Buddhism would suggest, that all of these things are things that we've been practicing since beginningless time. Buddhism says that there's no origin to the mind, and so we have, to one degree or another, but of course it's also true that we don't know what kinds of practices we've done in past lives. We don't know what kinds of virtuous karmic seeds we've created in past lives. And so we don't know, because we've talked about before in the previous classes about how Lama Yeshe has said things like that. That when we start to take these ideas seriously, put them into practice, we can't prejudge that process. We may be able to make really rapid progress due to past karmic seeds of virtue that we've laid in the mind. So that's also true. But yes, I mean, we would have to say that these more problematic aspects of ego have also existed before, and so, but of course, Buddhism also says, I mean, if we want to look at historical Buddhist ideas, also, Buddhism would say, well, even one human life is sufficient for fully achieving enlightenment, if that's something that we want to achieve. So it's very clear that there are practices and there are things that we can do that are so powerful that they overwhelm even countless past life familiarity with these more troublesome aspects of the mind. And just like, we talked before last week, again, thinking about switching self-cherishing for cherishing others, that by itself is something. It's, the four immeasurable thoughts, turning the mind toward developing a real, genuine interest in benefiting countless sentient beings is such an incredibly powerful mind that it purifies so much of that grasping that's happened over countless lifetimes. So, it's not all, it's certainly not doom and gloom, in that way. So here, he's reinforcing the idea where he's talking about guarding our karma, really talking about, on the basis of introspective awareness, bringing a lot of mindful attention to how we're using our body, using our speech, using even just our mind, even if we're just alone in our room, if we're having thoughts of ill will, things of that sort, then we're still using even just our mind in an unskillful way. So he's saying that the practice of really trying to bring a lot of careful, mindful awareness to how we're using the body, the speech, and the mind is a really, again, looking at where he says developing insight, it's really developing insight into how all of these states are interdependent and interrelated. And because, if we go out in our day, and in our day we're just allowing the body and the mind to yell at others, to say things that we know to be untrue, to take things that are not ours, and then we come home and we try to meditate on love and compassion, and we can see that disconnect, although of course there is always a disconnect when we start. There's always going to be a disconnect between the wisdoms that we're exposing ourselves to in study, in meditation, all of these ideals. They're not our lived experience right now. Of course, that's true. But we need a method. We need a method of bridging that gap, of making, of trying to make progress. And this idea of guarding our karma is a really important aspect of that bridging of the gap between, yes, we notice that, well, Buddhism suggests that, you know, that having all of these really sublime motivations, and that's the key, and that's the direction that we want to go on. And then of course we start to notice all of the ways in which we're sort of falling short of that in daily life. So we do notice this disconnect. Um, but then we should just then be patient and kind to ourselves, but still hold the aspiration to bridge that gap. And it's this method of guarding our karma that is the process by which we do bridge that gap. And we develop insight into understanding that what we allow ourselves to do in daily life profoundly influences our mental kind of landscape, our mental events. And that we can't do one and not the other. We have to work on both at the same time. We have to try to reduce the starting with kind of the coarse, behaviors and getting control over those. That will help us to rein in, slowly rein in, and get a better grasp on these subtler states of mind that we're trying to develop down the road. But if we never make any effort to guard our behaviors, we're just making it much more difficult for ourselves to try to shift that inner mental. But then, of course, it goes both ways. We can't expect to really consistently, dramatically shift our behaviors if we're not also giving ourselves opportunities in study and in meditation to focus in on the insights of these different things that when we do a meditation on love or compassion or generosity, we're giving ourselves a period of 10 or 20 minutes of focused attention on that quality. And that's also the vehicle that will reduce the behaviors that result from the lack of familiarity with love or compassion or generosity or so they, as if we go back to what we said earlier, both of these sides of the coin are interrelated and interdependent, and we try to work on both simultaneously. The idea is really just that we don't neglect one or the other. We simultaneously try to work on both, recognizing that they're interdependent, recognizing that we have to do both at the same time. Any thoughts or questions so far? But then, of course, did you have a question? Did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, so when you say guarding, I guess I'm understanding that it's more you understand karma, and your understanding of karma prevents you from creating fresh karma. Because when I hear guarding, I seem to think that I'm trying to preserve my own karma rather than understanding karma to avoid creating more karma. Would that be something?
Well, so karma, of course, Buddhism would so when we say karma, and of course this also depends on just how much detail we can and want to go into in terms of just the massive topic that is karma. Um, Karma, the law of cause and effect, Buddhism would suggest that we create karma all of the time, that we're creating karma constantly, that the mind is always moving to objects, and even if there's no overt action, even if it's just a mental action, that karma is being created. So, in a way, what we have, we can't really not create any karma, but we do have an increasing level of control over what Buddhism would suggest we can think about karma as being constructive or destructive, or we can think about it as being positive or negative. And again, these are not labels that are superimposed. These, again, were the direct experience of the historical Buddha who explained how the mind works, um, in the sense that some mental energies are correlated with either with both with happiness and contentment in the moment, and also then give rise to a karmic seed or a karmic potential. And that, I mean, that aspect of karma isn't so much what Lama Yeshe is necessarily emphasizing here, but also historical Buddhism would say that leaves a karmic imprint that ripens in a similar way in the future. So that's really the aspect of it that we do have control over, the extent to which, when we engage in an action, are we motivated by a very narrow, egoistic self-concern, or are we motivated by a broader, more compassionate, more generous, more selfless perspective that's taking into account the needs of others, the desires of others, how we impact on those around us. Um, and so, what is the nature of the energy, the motivation that is in the mind when the mind is engaging with some external circumstance? Um, we do have to. I mean, we are engaging. We do engage all the time, every day, with everything. We're engaging. We're relating, but we do have, and right now we don't have an extraordinary amount of control over that process. But slowly, slowly over time, as we get more and more control, then the aspect of that that we have control over is the quality of that energy, in a way, the actual nature of why, because as I mentioned, an action is just a mechanism for actualizing a motivation or actualizing an intention. I can eat solely out of a mindless kind of egoistic desire to shovel food into my face until I'm stuffed. Or I can transform the food that's in front of me into an offering, and think about it as a meditative practice. Uh, and in either case, I'm eating food. In either case, I'm engaging in exactly the same behavior, exactly the same action. I can give money to a charity either because I want my name in the newspaper, or because I just care about what the charity does and I just want them to be able to help other people, and I just want to give them the means to be able to do that. So in either case, we're engaging in an action, we're relating, and we're creating karma. But what the way in which I always try to think about it is, what is it that by engaging in this action, what is it that I personally am becoming more familiar with? Because we talked about how all of these things, everything that we do is creating habits, creating tendencies, creating familiarities. So by doing this action, what am I personally now that I've done it, what am I more familiar with than I was before I did it? And so if I eat mindlessly just with, then at the end of that, I've become more familiar with the energy of mindless, kind of just egoistic consumption. If I have instead transformed it into an offering, then by the end of that, I'm now more familiar than I was before with the spirit of the energy of making offerings and thinking about generosity and giving. Even though I may have eaten exactly the same food, the same amount of food, there's no difference in my action, but what I have, the habit, the tendency that I've deepened is completely different. Um, and like with the charity, in either case, the charity doesn't really care why they got the money. They can do whatever they can do with that $100. The social benefit is exactly the same. But what I am now more familiar with can be totally different. So whether or not it results in my happiness or my suffering has nothing to do really with the social result. It has to do with what my motivation was, with what the energy that went into it was. So in that way, guarding karma is about checking in with, why do I want to do this? Why do I want to say this thing or eat this thing or go drive and do this activity? What's my purpose? What is it? What is it that is animating this way of relating to this other person or this external event? Um, and then trying to shift that motivation from a narrow, egoistic preoccupation with something that's broader, something that's more virtuous, something that is not so focused on just getting only what I want out of the situation. Um, so it's really more so about kind of shifting, moving out of a space of that painful, narrow ego identity into a broader, more open, more virtuous way of thinking about others and trying to do more and more actions from that kind of motivation. And then so we'll end on this kind of hopeful, again, this more uplifting, hopeful idea, because, again, we of course, it's when karma and all of these things are brought up, what the mind naturally wants to go to are the negative aspects of karma. But of course, karma has many positive aspects. All of the virtuous things that we've done and will do are also part of that. Um, but what Lama Yeshe is helping us to understand here is that there are, as I mentioned last week, Buddhism never points out something to think about, never points out something to be concerned about, and then says, I'm sorry, you're just stuck with it. So here he's pointing out that there are methods for overcoming any kind of past negative familiarity or habit. And at the center, there are these purification practices that are done in the evenings. So that might be something that would be one mechanism that Lama Yeshe is not directly referencing, but that is if people do want to dip their toe into a more formal historical mechanism that's being hinted at here, that would be a place to maybe think about or look at that sort of thing. Any final thoughts or questions for today? No? Okay, so we do finish up next week. We finish up the material. So let's, as we do, just do a brief dedication. So at the beginning of the class, we set a virtuous motivation, and then we engaged in actions that were intended to bring about that virtuous motivation, and now we just try to relate to that in a way of offering it. So not clinging at it, not thinking how amazing am I for having done something, but just letting it go and offering it for the benefit of others. Thinking, may whatever positive energy I've created, may it ripen in the best way to be of benefit to other sentient beings. If we have some idea of enlightenment, then we can think, may it serve as a cause for my enlightenment in order to allow me to be of the greatest benefit to sentient beings. But really just trying to find a way of offering that for the benefit of others instead of looking at it as something that feeds our ego. All right. Well, thanks for coming. Have a good weekend. Stay safe.